Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is grandfather. And this verb was suggested by the viewer Luis. So, Luis, thank you so much for sharing yet another great idea. Now, let's take a moment and review the definition of this verb. There's really only one way this verb gets used, and that means to exempt someone from or something from a new law or a new regulation. And I think it's important for us to understand the history of this verb. Um, the first examples of it being used occur in the late 1800s. So, as verbs go, it's a bit on the newer side. It hasn't existed for hundreds of years, like many of those that we discuss here. And it came to be after the US Civil War, where the North and the South were fighting. One of the major issues that war was over was around the subject of slavery. And after the war, we had amendments to our Constitution that would no longer allow someone to not be able to vote based on the color of their skin. And naturally, many people were not happy about this, particularly the people in the South who had been fighting to perpetuate the system of slavery. They came up with ways to kind of work around it. And so there were certain laws suggesting, well, if your father and grandfather had voted, then you could vote. And this might be a way of around saying we're not going to allow black people to vote. Right? We didn't say that. It's just, of course, their fathers and grandfathers couldn't vote. So the origin of this is a little uncomfortable, but again, I think it's always important for us to know that this verb is still widely used anytime we have new laws, new policies, and there are people who still sort of want to be treated or be able to fall under the old rules. And that's what you're going to see some more examples of as we go along here. But for now, you should know that grandfather is a regular verb. If you want to make the progressive form of this verb, just add ing, and that forms grandfathering. The past tense and the participle form of this verb can be made by adding ed. Our base verb, grandfather, ends in a voiced R sound. This means our ed ending is just going to make a D sound, and we're not going to add an extra syllable when we say it. So the past tense and the participle form of our verb should sound like this: grandfathered, grandfathered. Okay? Now, we may encounter one phrasal verb. Our meaning here is pretty much the same, but the phrasal verb you might see or hear is to grandfather in. And again, what this means is we are exempting a certain group from some sort of new policy, new restriction, or maybe some new limitation. This is going to allow them to continue doing what they have been doing, or maybe it might allow them to continue benefiting from something just as they had done before. Let's take a look at an example of this. The NHL required helmets beginning in 1979, but the league grandfathered in players active before that time. So here, NHL refers to the National Hockey League. This is professional hockey in North America. There are teams in both the United States and Canada. And this is a true example. For many years, the league did not require a player to wear protective gear on their head, a helmet. But a new policy was created, but they said, okay, this is for players who join the league going forward. We'd like everybody to wear them, but if you were already an active player prior to this rule, you don't have to wear a helmet. So many players into the 80s and even into the 90s. There were a few who still weren't wearing them because they had um, entered the league in the earlier 70s. Fun fact. Now, before we move on to our verb tense, I want to talk a little bit about the active and passive voice. As I thought about examples of how our verb of the day gets used, I really encountered so many examples in the passive voice. So it seemed natural, and it's been a little while since we've reviewed this. So most of the time, when I give you example sentences in these videos, they are in the active voice. That means the sentence begins with the person or the thing that is responsible for the action. Sometimes it's easier to kind of think of like the person doing the action. I've got two examples of active voice sentences here. Tim will clean the house tomorrow. Leslie will write notes. Okay, so we know Tim is going to be responsible for the action of cleaning. Leslie is responsible for the action of writing. Okay? When we make sentences in the passive voice, though, we are going to begin with the person or the thing that is acted on. You might also think of this as the thing or person receiving the action. In the passive voice, we may or may not know who is responsible for doing the action. If we are told that, that's going to come at the end of the sentence, and usually that name of the person or the name of the group of the people will follow the preposition by. So many students always ask then, why do we have this, right? Why are we making things even more complex? Well, sometimes the passive voice gets used because we don't know who to say is responsible for the action. Other times it's because the person doing the action just isn't all that important. And connected to that, a writer or speaker really might want their readers or listeners to pay attention to the thing or person that's being acted on. So, usually starting our sentence with that is going to result in someone paying a bit more attention. Another common reason you'll see passive voice used is if we do not want to assign blame, right? Or say, like, this person is responsible for this not so great action. So, those are some ways you might encounter it. Now, let's look at simple future sentences. And I want us to compare active and passive voice. My passive voice examples are all sort of real ones. I looked through various newspaper articles, blog posts, and the like to find examples of this. And I'll also note, as you've seen, most of our examples are somehow going to be connected to laws, regulations, rules, things of that nature. So the examples here may seem a bit technical or a little specific, but let's start with our passive voice in the affirmative. Okay, let's look at the example there. It says, your pre-2026 gifts will be grandfathered in and will not be subject to additional estate tax. So this sentence came from a blog post discussing various U.S. tax law changes. And again, not to get too technical, but there are certain limits related to gifts in the United States and what creates sort of taxable gifts versus not taxable gifts. And those limits can change. And this example sentence is saying, right, if you do this particular action before 2026, you're going to fall under the old rules. What are the rules going to be in 2026? We'll see what our government does. Now, how that might look in the active voice would be like this. The IRS, there's our taxing authority here in the United States. The IRS will grandfather your pre-2026 gifts and they will not be subject to additional estate tax, right? So there we know who is responsible for the action. We talk a lot about making sentences in the simple future. All of our examples here are going to have will. In the active voice, the structure is will and then base verb. So you can see there, will grandfather. In the passive voice, what we use is will, then be, and then the participle form of our verb. So will be grandfathered. Now let's move on and look at some negative sentences. And again, let's start with the passive voice first. This example says, if the social media ban is passed, children under the age of 16 who are already using social media won't be grandfathered in. Okay, so there's our negative. Will not be, and the participle form of the verb. What that sentence might look like in the active voice would be something like this. If the social media ban is passed, the government won't grandfather in children under the age of 16 who are already using social media. These sentences come from news stories related to some proposed legislation in Australia. So, something that would essentially not allow younger people to use social media. And what's being proposed most recently doesn't require or doesn't add like a special exemption. So if somebody, let's say they're 15 and they're using social media right now and this law goes into effect, they have to stop. They don't get to continue. Now let's look at making yes or no questions in the passive voice. And we'll look at our example here and talk a little bit about that structure. Will people over 55 be grandfathered into the current version of Social Security under this plan? Okay, so our structure here, we used will, then we have our object, right? The group here that is receiving the action. You see be, and then the participle form of our verb. Again, this example might seem a little confusing, but we have a system where older individuals who have worked, or maybe if they have spouses who have worked and have passed away, receive monthly income, right? And we're trying to make sure the elders in our communities are able to live and eat and be prosperous, right? And that program or system is called Social Security. And there are challenges with that program, and people put forth different plans on how to make it better. When it was created back in the 1940s, the average lifespan was not as long as it is today. So many people say, you know what, it would be better if we started this like later as people were getting older. So that they're not drawing this monthly income for as long of an amount of time. Of course, if they make that change, right, is it going to affect someone who's getting it today and now they're not going to get it tomorrow because they're too young? So many of these proposals look at exempting or treating certain groups of people under the old system. And that will give younger people sort of time to plan and account for it. Let's take a look at what that question might look like in the active voice. Will the government grandfather people over 55 into the current version of Social Security under this plan? So again, now we know who is responsible for this action. And again, I think many of our examples here, you'll notice, are subjects or the entities responsible for this action are either governments, governmental departments and divisions. And so I think that's another example of why you see passive voice here. It's like, yeah, we know who's sort of responsible for it. Who is this affecting? What groups are going to be affected? So by changing the structure of our sentence, it becomes a little more obvious or clearer to your reader or listener who is receiving this action and who is being impacted. Now, let's spend a moment looking at some words that are related to our verb grandfather. And the first word we're going to look at, of course, is the noun form of this word. The noun grandfather has the exact same spelling and the exact same pronunciation as our verb. When we use this word, we are generally referring to the father of our father or the father of our mother. Let's take a look at an example of this. My maternal grandfather worked in construction, and my paternal grandfather worked in manufacturing. So here, maternal grandfather means the father of my mother. Paternal grandfather is referring to my dad's father or my dad's dad. Okay, so that's one way you might hear and see that noun used. Another related word, and something that we discussed earlier in this video, the grandfather clause. This noun, again, refers to a special exemption for a class of people or a group of things. And again, this exemption is kind of like a special thing for new legislation that is going to impact things that were previously done, maybe previous rights, previous privileges, or practices. So, an example of this in a sentence might be the bill has a grandfather clause that allows doctors to continue treatment on patients that have already started. Okay? So what this is suggesting is, sounds like there's going to be some new state rules around what kind of treatment doctors can provide in certain situations. However, if you already have a patient, you're already treating them, then this new law, or proposed law in this case, because it's a bill, will not apply. One last word for us today. It's the adjective grandfatherly. So here we're describing someone who is acting or behaving like a grandfather. And I would say this adjective has a very positive meaning to it. So we're generally describing something that's being done in a kind, nurturing, and or protective way. So an example of this might be the actor has embraced grandfatherly roles in the last 5 years. So sounds like this person, they may actually be portraying a grandfather or just that older, kind of more well-respected individual who is going to exemplify those qualities of being kind, protective, and nurturing. Again, I want to say a special thanks to Louise for suggesting today's verb, and I want to thank you all for watching. Have a great day.